You think you know Japan, the temples, the samurai, the mythology. You've seen the surface, and the surface is extraordinary. But underneath it, there is another Japan. Older, stranger, darker. A Japan that was deliberately erased from the official record. Buried, hidden. This channel goes there. In the 3rd century AD, the most powerful ruler in Japan was a woman. She controlled a confederation of more than 30 kingdoms. She sent envoys to China. China sent envoys back. She received official recognition from the Wei Court, a golden seal, bronze mirrors, silk, the diplomatic currency of the ancient world. Her name appears in Chinese records compiled in the late 3rd century. Those records are considered among the most reliable primary sources for ancient Japanese history. Her name does not appear in Japan's own official histories, not in the Kojiki compiled in 712 AD, not by name in the Nihon Shoki compiled in 720 AD. She is simply not there. The question is why, and the answer tells us something important about how Japan's official history was made. Her name was Himiko. She ruled a kingdom called Yamatai in a country the Chinese called Wa, ancient Japan. The source is the Gishi Wajinden, the account of the Wa people in the records of Wei, a Chinese dynastic chronicle compiled around 297 AD by a court historian named Chen Shou. This is not a legend, this is not mythology. This is a bureaucratic record written by people whose job was to document the foreign relations of the Wei Court. And here is what they documented. Himiko came to power after decades of civil war among the kingdoms of Wa. She was chosen as ruler not by conquest but by consensus. The chieftains of the most powerful kingdoms agreed that her authority was legitimate. The records describe her as a shaman, someone who occupied herself with magic and sorcery, bewitching the people. This wasn't a criticism, this was how she ruled, through spiritual authority, through rituals, through her role as an intermediary between the human world and the divine. She never appeared in public. She communicated through a single male attendant. Over 1,000 women served her. She lived in a palace surrounded by towers and armed guards. In 238 AD, she sent envoys to the Wei Court in China. The Wei Emperor responded by granting her an official title, Queen of Wa, friendly to Wei. She received the golden seal, bronze mirrors, silk cloth, and recorded specifically 100 bronze mirrors. She died around 248 AD. A great burial mound was raised for her, more than 100 paces across, the records say. Over 100 attendants followed her into the grave. This is the most documented ruler of 3rd century Japan. And Japan's own histories act as if she never existed. To understand why Himiko was erased, you have to go back to the year 645. At that time, the most powerful force in Japan wasn't the emperor. It was a clan called the Soga. For decades, the Soga had controlled the imperial court, placing their own candidates on the throne, removing rulers they didn't want, arranging marriages that kept power within their reach. In 645, that ended. A prince named Naka no Oe, later Emperor Tenji, and a nobleman named Nakatomi no Kamatari conspired to assassinate the Soga clan leader, Soga no Iruka, in the imperial palace, in front of the empress herself. It was a calculated, violent removal of the most powerful man in Japan. The next day, Iruka's father, Soga no Emishi, saw that everything was lost. He set fire to his own residence. Inside that residence were Japan's historical records. The Tennoki, the Chronicle of the Empress, documents that had been compiled over generations, recording the lineages, the events, the history of the court. The Tennoki burned completely. A fragment of another chronicle was pulled from the flames, but the core record was gone. This is documented. This is not speculation. The Nihon Shoki itself records that the fire destroyed the manuscripts. What had been written in those records we do not know. We will never know, because they burned. And 67 years later, the victors wrote new ones. In the 680s, Emperor Tenmu, the ruler who had seized power in a civil war, gave an order. He commanded a court scholar named Hieda no Are to memorize Japan's genealogies and oral traditions. The official histories that existed, Tenmu believed, contained errors and distortions. He wanted them corrected. Tenmu died before the project was finished. It was completed decades later, in 712 AD, under Empress Genmei. A court official named O no Yasumaro transcribed Hieda no Are's memorized accounts into what became the Kojiki, Japan's oldest surviving chronicle. 8 years later, in 720, the Nihon Shoki followed. The men who shaped this process understood exactly what they were doing. Tenmu had won a civil war by defeating his own nephew. His legitimacy as emperor was, by any normal standard, questionable. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki were not neutral archives. They were political documents, designed to establish a divine, unbroken line of male emperors, stretching back to the gods themselves. And deeply involved in the Nihon Shoki's compilations was Fujiwara no Fuhito, son of Nakatomi no Kamatari, the man who had helped murder Soga no Iruka in 645. The Fujiwara clan's power rested on the legitimacy of the imperial line they had helped install. They had every reason to shape how that history was written. These chronicles were written in Chinese characters, compiled largely by scholars with deep knowledge of Chinese models of history, many of them of Korean or continental origin. They were building a particular kind of state, modeled on Tang China, centralized, bureaucratic, with a divine emperor at its center. A female shaman queen who had ruled by spiritual authority, recognized by China as the legitimate ruler of Japan, did not fit that model. To understand the political pressure these historians were under, consider what had just happened. In 663 AAD, less than 50 years before the Kojiki was compiled, Japan suffered one of the worst military defeats in its early history. At the Battle of Baekgang, Japan's navy was destroyed by a combined Silla-Tang alliance. Japan had tried to restore its ally back here on the Korean peninsula and failed completely. The Japanese fleet was burned. The army retreated. The Tang Empire was now the dominant power in East Asia, and Japan's new rulers needed to establish their legitimacy, not just domestically, but in the eyes of China. The solution was history, specifically. A history that showed Japan as a coherent nation with an unbroken imperial line stretching back to the gods, not a collection of competing chiefdoms, not a country once ruled by a female shaman recognized by China as its legitimate queen. Think about what Himiko represented. She was a woman. She ruled by shamanic authority, not military or bureaucratic power. And, perhaps most problematically, she had been recognized by China as Japan's legitimate ruler in the 3rd century. If you were trying to establish the divine, unbroken male imperial lineage of the Yamato court, Himiko's existence was a problem. A female ruler, recognized by China, not descended from the Yamato line, not part of the story the new state needed to tell. So she was not part of the story they told. But here is the thing about erasure, it is rarely total. The Nihon Shoki does not name Himiko, but it quotes the Weizhi 3 times, the exact same Chinese chronicle that documented her. It mentions that envoys from Wa were sent away in 239, 240 and 243 AD. It uses the phrase, the Queen of Wa, and then it doesn't say who that queen was. The editors of the Nihon Shoki knew who Himiko was. They had the Weizhi in front of them. They chose to reference it without naming her. That is not omission by accident. That is a deliberate editorial decision. And there is something else. In the Nihon Shoki, there is a figure called Yamato Totohi Momoso Jaime. She was the aunt of Emperor Sujin, a shaman, described as a shrewd and intelligent person who could foresee the future. She helped end a period of national calamity through spiritual authority. She lived in seclusion. She communicated divine will to the emperor through a single male intermediary. Does any of that sound familiar? The resemblance to Himiko, as described in the wager, is striking. A female shaman, spiritual authority, seclusion, communication through a male attendant. The same era, roughly, as Himiko's reign. And her burial mound, the Hashihaka Kofun in Nara Prefecture, was dated using radiocarbon analysis to approximately 240 to 260 AD. Himiko, according to the Weiji, died around 248 AD. The dates align. The tomb measures over 280 meters in length. The Weiji says Himiko's grave was more than 100 paces in diameter. This theory that Yamato Totohi Momoso Jaime and Himiko are the same person has been proposed by Japanese historians since at least the Taisho era. It is not fringe. It is one of the serious scholarly positions in what has been called, by one historian, the greatest debate over the ancient history of Japan. The Imperial Household Agency designates the Hashihaka Kofun as an imperial tomb. Extensive archaeological excavation is prohibited. The burial chamber has never been opened. We do not know who is inside. Let's take stock of what we know. A female shaman queen ruled Japan in the 3rd century. She is the most documented ruler of the era, documented by China, not by Japan. Japan's own histories, compiled 4 centuries later by the people who had the most to gain from a specific version of history, do not name her. The documents that might have told a different story burned in 645. And the figure in Japan's official record who most resembles her is buried in a tomb the government will not allow archaeologists to fully excavate. She may have been erased, or she may have been transformed, her identity absorbed into a figure who could exist within the story the new state needed to tell, not eliminated, reassigned. And here is the larger picture that Himiko's story points toward. In the 3rd century, Japan was led by a female shaman queen. She ruled by spiritual authority. China recognized her as Japan's legitimate sovereign. The country she governed was a loose confederation of chiefdoms, decentralized, ritual-based, with a woman at its center. By the 5th century, that Japan no longer existed. In its place, the Yamato state, centralized, patrilineal, with a divine male emperor at its head, descended in an unbroken line from the gods themselves. That is not a gradual evolution, that is a transformation. And the blank of 150 years, the same blank we looked at in the first episode, sits exactly between those two Japans. The Kojiki and Nihon Shoki encoded everything before the 5th century as myth, the gods, the creation of the islands, the divine emperors who lived impossibly long lives. What we would call history was rewritten in the language of legend, and here is something worth noting. The Chinese records, the wager, and the chronicles that followed documented Japan in detail through the 3rd century. Then they go largely silent on Japan's internal affairs for exactly this period. Whether that silence is coincidence or consequence, the outside witness disappears at precisely the moment the inside story was being rewritten. 150 years, no Japanese writing yet. The Chinese records quiet, the documents that existed burnt. And when the record resumes, a new Japan, a new story, written by the people who won. Was the blank created deliberately? Or did it simply form the natural gap between a world that ended and a world that hadn't yet learned to write itself down? I don't think we can answer that cleanly, but I think the question is worth sitting with. The people who write history decide what history is. That was true in 712. It is true now. If you want to keep exploring the layers they left out, subscribe. New episodes every Thursday. Next time, the Kojiki was compiled in 712, but the myths inside it are much older, or at least they claim to be. Stories about gods fighting, a sun goddess hiding in a cave, a land being offered up by its own rulers without a war. The standard reading is that these are creation myths, sacred stories, the spiritual foundation of Japan. But there is another way to read them. What if the myth of the gods is actually a record of something that happened? A conquest, a transfer of power, a suppression of older beliefs, rewritten in the only language the new rulers would allow. What if the gods who peacefully surrendered their land were not gods at all? What if they were the people who came before? Thursday,